Dzień dobry, po raz kolejny. Zapraszam Państwa już do odebrania słuchawek, odpowiedniego sprzętu. Tak podążając korytarzami trochę podsłuchujemy i okazuje się, że jedna z powtarzających się refleksji to taka, że to już trzeci dzień, że to już tyle za nami, jak to szybko czas mija. Tak? Tak? Ja myślę, że to jest jedna kwestia, czy też jeden poziom refleksji. Drugi poziom to taki, że jeszcze sporo bardzo ciekawych rzeczy przed nami. Wobec tego zapraszam, żebyśmy mogli za chwilkę rozpocząć sesję plenarną. Jeszcze raz witam serdecznie. Wracam do wątku dotyczącego jeszcze kilku bardzo ciekawych wydarzeń, które przed nami. Wszyscy pamiętamy, że tematem przewodnim tegorocznej konferencji jest przywództwo, zatem nieprzypadkowo gościem i prelegentem w czasie sesji plenarnej będzie nasz gość. Mam przyjemność przedstawić dr Robin Precey, który o tym przywództwie będzie za chwilę opowiadał. Zapraszam do wykładu.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to speak at your very important and significant conference today. I hope that all those people that don't speak English have a headset on. Because if you don't, I am assuming you speak English or you are not interested. So a few points by way of introduction. First of all, I, in the next 45 minutes, want to paint a big picture of education. And looking at the program and attending some sessions, there have been some very interesting workshops looking at practice around Europe. And so what I'm going to say is a bigger picture than many of the workshops. Secondly, I want to offer a critical but positive view of what's happening in education today. And thirdly, I want to finish by dinner time, which is 6 o'clock. So any questions you have, and I hope there are many questions, we will deal with in the panel session after dinner, if that's okay with you. In the next 40 minutes or so, I want to look at five areas, really. First of all, where are we in terms of schooling and education today? And obviously this is a very general view. Secondly, where do we need to be in terms of schooling today? Thirdly, to look at the changing world of education. and then to look fourthly at the sort of leaders that I believe we need in education today, and lastly, how we can prepare and continue to develop leaders to be effective in schools in the 21st century. So those are the 5 sections that I want to look at. And I hope I raised lots of questions for you, as I said, and I hope you will disagree with some of what I say. I'm sure you will. So first of all, where are we in terms of schools today? Where are we going? And there are 4 separate but related ideas I want to present to you to answer this question. The first is from the OECD that I'm sure you know about. In a recent report about school leadership, they noted the dramatic changes taking place in leadership of schools. In particular, 3 things: the increased amount of autonomy of schools. This is generally, obviously. Schools are taking on more responsibility. Secondly, the increased accountability for the outcomes of schools. And thirdly, the focus on learning-centered leadership, that leaders need to be and are becoming more focused on what's happening in the classroom. Now, I would say this has always been so, but the difference is it's much more visible now. School leaders have nowhere to hide, even if they wanted to. So that's the OECD view. The second view is from a recent book by Pasi Sahlberg, which you may have come across. It was published about a month ago, called Finnish Lessons. And Pasi Sahlberg is based in Finland, and he has written about something he calls GERM, the Global Education Reform Movement, which he sees as a virus, like the flu, spreading across the world. Some people call it the English disease, because in England we very much are following this agenda. And you can see there what the agenda is, of competition, which are starting to erode, some would argue, traditional public school systems. A narrower curriculum focused on what we can measure, particularly English, maths and science. And we value what we measure. Standardized testing, monitoring through inspection, high levels of public accountability, and the result of that, Sahlberg says, and I agree with him, is a lack of trust, lower morale in the profession, and indeed, can we call teaching a profession anymore? Now, Sahlberg's interesting because he's writing from a Finnish perspective as top of the league table, top of PISA. And he contrasts countries that are affected by germ with what's happening in Finland. In Finland, the agenda is almost the opposite of what's happening in many other countries. So I think that's an interesting piece of comment from an expert who's working in an environment that many countries would like to be like. Third comment is a picture from Linda Evans, who has this picture of schools as cupcakes, beautiful cupcakes, with different colored icing, with decorations, and she sees the world of education today as a cookie cutter coming with a shape imposed from outside, cutting into the cupcakes and throwing away all the bits around the outside. And often they're the tastiest bits, have the most icing. And she says that we discard a lot of what is good in schools through an imposed agenda. And what happens is the baker starts to create cupcakes which are the shape of the cupcake cookie cutter. We start to create schools which fit the mold. And I think that's quite a powerful image for us to think about. Is that what's happening in school systems? And fourthly, one of my favourite writers on education, Michael Fielding, who actually is going to come to Kraków this summer to speak at an Erasmus conference, he writes about the importance of relationships in education. That some relationships are purely functional. We do things because we expect something back. And other relationships are personal. We do things because we care about people. And he argues quite eloquently that schools have moved towards a focus on performance and functional relationships. Children are only valued if they produce the results. Whereas he argues that we should have schools which are person-centered, where we care about children, whatever they do. We want them to do well, but we want them to achieve, which is much broader than simply attaining test results. So those four commentaries, I think, the OECD, Pasi Sahlberg, Michael Fielding, and the fourth one, the image of the cookie cutter, I think tell us something about the views of people about where we are today. I don't know what you think. The second thing I want to look at is where we need to be going. If these are some commentaries of it on education today, where do we need to go? And again, I just want to present a few ideas for you to think about, both from research, and then link that with policy. The first piece of research, which is very significant, certainly for England, is what's called the Cambridge Primary Review. This was produced by Cambridge University quite recently and is a massive, a very big study of research into what makes effective education. Primary schools in England are for children aged 4 to 11, but the lessons in this research are for all children. And as I mentioned in a workshop this morning, the Secretary of State for Education, when he received this report a couple of years ago, put it in the bin. He discarded it, despite the fact it's many, many years of research. But the current Secretary of State has decided that some of the report is useful. And it's a very big report, but the conclusions to the report are interesting. And these are general statements, but you can get a flavour of what the authors, Robin Alexander and his team, are saying. Just to pick up a few. You can read these for yourself. This is available on the web, so you can download this and read it in more detail. One important conclusion for me is the idea that effective schools require guidance, not prescription. That we need teachers who have a repertoire of skills, not a recipe for fixing things. And I think that's really important, that teachers are treated and developed as professionals that have the skills to cope with changing environments. They also stress the importance of sustainability, that we need schools to be able to bring about changes which are followed through and not keep changing the changes. And they stress the importance of democratic engagement in education and give many examples through research of the power of student voice, of parent voice, and involving the community in the development of schools. And they also stress the importance of evidence which is not politically biased. All these things are contained in the report. And this report is starting to have an impact on policy, certainly in England. And it's something I think I'd recommend to you if you're interested in a detailed analysis of how effective education can take place and can be improved. The second piece of evidence is something many of you probably know, is John Hattie's work in New Zealand, in Auckland. Hattie's study is different because it's a meta-analysis. It's a study of the research done into effective teaching and learning. And it's something like 5,000 research studies they've analysed involving 200 million children around the world. So it's pretty significant. Now, there are lots of questions about the validity of the research, but what they do is to suggest that there are certain things we know seem to work in terms of improving the quality of children's learning. Their focus is more on attainment than achievement, is more on improving test scores. But what they say in terms of leadership, these are the 5 things that seem to make a difference. In reverse order, the bottom one is about the idea, if I can read my writing in this light, having an orderly environment, because student behavior comes out very highly in terms of effective learning and teaching, an orderly environment. And then the idea of embedding goals and expectations. These things are important. But the most important thing that Hattie's conclusions come to is the professional development of teachers and leaders, where teachers are continuing to learn relevant skills and knowledge to improve their classroom practice, then that has a big impact on learning in the classroom. And the same is true for leaders. Leaders who display a passion for learning are more likely to have an impact on the quality of learning. So what Hattie suggests is that promoting and participating in professional learning about learning and teaching is very powerful. One of the most effective strategies that a school leader can do. But the focus has to be on teaching and learning. So those are 2 very big pieces of research, the Cambridge Primary Review with Robin Alexander and Hattie's work on visible learning. It's called visible learning because he stresses the power of feedback to make learning more visible, so you can see when learning takes place. Those 2 bits of research, particularly the last one, have impacted on policy in England. So we have a new series of laws affecting education in England. And these are the 3 main parts of the legislation in England today. The law is called The Importance of Teaching. Interesting. And the focus of the new legislation is to improve the quality of teachers. That's the agenda for England, certainly for the next few years, is to raise the quality of teachers. A second key part of the policy is to devolve as much power and responsibility to schools as possible. Already in England, schools have their own budgets. Principals of schools manage their own finances. And the government is keen that school principals should effectively be managing directors of schools. But the other side of that responsibility is the accountability. In England, there is a very high level of accountability through inspections. And Ofsted are very significant in the lives of teachers and leaders. And the third main strand here is about the moral purpose of the legislation is to try and ensure that no child fails within the system. In England, there is a big difference between high-achieving students and low achieving students. And the government want to close the gap between the two. That's our legislation, and the two bits of research I've mentioned have fed into that. But politicians are selective, and so they've selected bits of the research that fit with that agenda. So, that's the way education, informed by research, certainly in England, is heading. And I think there are some good things there. But let's look, thirdly, third part of this talk is about our changing world, the world of education. Because I think there is a danger of preparing children and preparing school leaders to work in a world which has changed significantly, but not allowing them to be successful in this new world. So a picture, you probably recognize that because it is the Eiffel Tower. And the Eiffel Tower was built in 1889 by Gustav Eiffel as the entrance to the 1889 World's Fair. It's 324 meters high, and when Gustav Eiffel was building it in the 19th century, this is what was a key principle behind the design. At the bottom, it says, "Now, to what phenomenon did I give primary concern in designing the tower? It was wind resistance. Well then, I hold that the curvature of the monument's four outer edges, which is as mathematical calculation dictated it should be, will give great impression of strength and beauty, for it revealed to the eyes of the observer the boldness of the design as a whole." In other words, when Gustav Eiffel was building this, he followed mathematical, scientific principles to reduce the impact of wind and create something of great beauty. It was a predictable world of science. Move forward to the 21st century. Anybody recognize this? You'll see many pictures of this in the coming months because it's the entrance to the Olympic site in London. It's a massive piece of sculpture by Amish Kapoor, and it's just being finished. It's the entrance to the Olympic Park in London. It's 115 meters high. It looks like it's going to fall over, but in fact, it's very stable. And the architect, or the sculptor, when he was building this, his overriding principle was he wanted to create the sensation of instability. I think that's quite a powerful metaphor for the 21st century compared to the 19th and 20th. Now, if you're a historian, you might argue that there was big instability or instability in those centuries as well. But the reality is the 21st century is very unpredictable, and it's difficult to prepare children for that world, and it's difficult for leaders to operate in that world. But that is the reality of the world today. The world is more like that than it is like that today, I would argue. And education needs to broaden. Currently, the focus is on knowledge that we can measure, attainment. I would certainly argue that the point of going to school is much broader than that. It's about skills and attitudes, and ultimately it's about children learning about learning, developing a passion for learning. Because what we do know about the future is people will need to continue to learn and be excited about learning. But it's also about building good relationships, creating a society which is better than the one we live in today. And schools really do shape the future. So it's really important that what our schools do is shaping a future that we want to be part of. So the agenda is much bigger in the future. It's more complex. And this brings me on to the reality of schools today and how we can prepare school leaders to work in this reality. Because schools are not predictable places. They are much more complex and diverse. They are becoming more complex and more diverse as the years go by. But some people still see schools like clocks, predictable places that we know what's going to happen tomorrow and know what's going to happen in 5 years' time. I think there is some element of that, but I think schools are also like clouds. We understand the physics of clouds, but we can't predict the shape of the clouds in 20 minutes' time. What we have to do is to admire their beauty, but be prepared to work in that environment. So I'm suggesting to you that we need both, but perhaps our schools have been too rooted in the image of a clock rather than a cloud. And so I just want to explore briefly the idea of complexity in schools, because schools are very complex places. If you imagine a typical school with perhaps 500 children, all different personalities, all in different emotional states, all at different points in their learning. And then imagine the teachers, and then imagine the parents. We're dealing with a very complex organization. We cannot just program people to behave in ways we wish they would behave. And there's some interesting work done by Otto Schama, based on the work of Kahan, who says there are 3 aspects to complexity which we can relate to schools. First of all, dynamic complexity, where the gap between cause and effect is not easy to see. And that's true of education. Just because you do this and this and this in a classroom, it doesn't necessarily lead to what you expect. It's much more complex than that. Secondly, if I take this one second, there's what's called social complexity. And in education, that's about the many different perspectives on education. The different students' perspectives, but also the parents' perspectives, the government's perspectives, the teachers' perspectives. So there's great complexity in terms of the social perspectives on education. And that leads to the emergent complexity. So if we put those together, we have schools that work in unfamiliar and unpredictable circumstances. We might think schools can be managed and controlled very easily, but in fact they are very complex places. And when I was a head teacher, I now recognize that was the state that we operated in. Some people call it on the edge of chaos. Schools are almost on the edge of chaos all the time. And there are 4 things we know about complexity. So this I think is important for head teachers and school leaders to know. First of all, that schools are dynamic places, continually reinventing themselves. They never achieve total equilibrium. New children come into the school, new teachers come into the school, changes happen in the school. They are constantly evolving. Leaders need to be comfortable with that. Secondly, it may look chaotic, just like when you canoe down a river with white water. It's going very fast. But the more experience you have, the more wisdom you gain, the more you can see where you can go fast, the places to avoid, and there is a pattern to complexity. But that's gained through wisdom and knowledge. Thirdly, there are critical points where decisions have to be made in schools, where you know that if you go off in one direction, it will take you in a very different place to if you go in another direction. And so leaders need to be able to recognize those points of bifurcation, the points that are most important. What are the key decisions in a school that are going to take you in one direction rather than another? Because once you go in one direction, it's very difficult to come back to where you wish you were. And thirdly, the idea of lock-in and complexity theory, that sometimes organizations get fixed in their ways, inertia, and leaders need to be able to sometimes move organizations forward in a productive way rather than just get set in your ways. And in terms of the changes in society, it's not possible for schools to be too fixed in their ways. They have to keep moving forward. That, I think, is a better description of the world today, the world of clouds, than the world of clocks, in terms of leadership. So, what sort of leaders do we need? Sounds like a big, big job, doesn't it? And it is a big job. And we have this dichotomy between the rational, scientific world of leadership, which I would call management, and the more complex world of leadership that I'm advocating, which is about the real world, the life world. And these are some of the writers that you might put down this side. Carolyn Shields is a particularly good writer who writes about this, both aspects of leadership. And some people use the term transformational and transactional leadership. And I'm arguing that if we want leaders, we need to be more transformational in their approach. And I won't read that list through. You can read that for yourself, particularly if you download the PowerPoint. So, in conclusion, what sort of leaders do we need? In conclusion, in this section. Well, these are my thoughts. That we need leaders in schools and in government and everywhere else, in fact, able to understand this sort of world. That the solution to the problem may well as yet be unknown. We are working towards it. That the problem is still unfolding, it may not be clear. And that the key stakeholders are often not clear about what they want as well. And so I'm suggesting that these are some of the key ingredients to effective leadership of schools today. And number one is there because it is number one, I think, a sense of moral purpose, which is what leaders need to keep coming back to. If you're in very, very stormy waters, you need a strong rudder. You need to know what you're trying to achieve. And then these other things follow about moral courage and bravery, about integrity. I'll come back to that in a minute. Intelligence. We need teachers, leaders rather, who are thinking and thoughtful. They are thinking because they can act and react to situations effectively, but they are thoughtful because they have worked out what their values are. We need, Mike Bottery calls effective leaders horizon scanners. They're constantly looking at the horizon, looking at what's coming up in the future. We need leaders who, Sally Power calls this here, have a professional imagination. They can give themselves a context and are not too disheartened by external measures of their performance. We need leaders who are flexible. We need leaders who are entrepreneurial, can spot opportunities, adaptable, leaders that develop trust, leaders who are comfortable with ambiguity, but ultimately leaders who have a sharp focus on student learning. I would say that these are some of the qualities we need in our leaders today. So, finally, how do we prepare and train people to become school leaders and continue to develop them, because it's a never-ending journey? I'm not suggesting that school leaders should look like this, by the way. 5 things. First of all, we need to prepare leaders for the 21st century, for this world of diversity, uncertainty, complexity. We cannot continue to prepare leaders for the 19th century, or indeed the 20th century. This preparation and development needs to be based on professional standards. And I think these standards need to incorporate values, behavior, knowledge and skills. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And that need requires a development framework for school leaders that we apply consistently, both in the preparation of leaders and the development in leaders, and indeed in the selection of leaders for posts in schools. And leaders need to know about learning. They need to know about leadership. They need to know about management. And they need to know about impact, the effect that changes have, and how you measure that. Fourthly, this framework for development of leaders needs to be used in terms of planning development programs for school leaders. And by leaders, I mean people at all levels. Because in organizations in the 21st century, leadership needs to be shared. So teachers are leaders. And so we need to prepare everybody to take a leadership role. And fifthly, the people that develop the leaders need to be very high quality. They need to be able to facilitate the learning highly effectively. So I just offer you finally before dinner a model to think about and to critique. First of all, the importance of integrity in leadership. The way I see it is integrity is a link between what we think and what we say and what we do. And integrity is where those three things are aligned. Sometimes we, and I've been guilty of this, as leaders, say one thing but do another. And then trust will start to disappear because it's behaviors that people tend to notice in leaders. So leaders have a tough job to match up what they do with what they say and what they believe. This, you can't read all of this, but this is on the PowerPoint if you download it. This is the model that we use in the National College for School Leadership in England. In England, the government under Tony Blair set up a national college to train and develop school leaders at Nottingham. And I've been involved in that since it started in the year 2000. And I was involved in writing this framework with two colleagues, and this is used for the preparation of school leaders at all levels. And I can talk more about this for those that are interested later, but essentially down here are the areas of knowledge that school leaders are expected to acquire. The ones I've mentioned, knowledge about learning, leadership, about management and about impact. Here are the skills leaders are expected to acquire, for example, the management of groups and developing inquiry strategies, asking the right questions that are useful. And those skills we can either use or not use. We choose to use them in different circumstances. But most of this is taken up by competencies. And this is based on the work of Daniel Goleman, David McClelland and others, because particularly Daniel Goleman would argue that 80% of effective leadership is about emotional intelligence. And so there's a big emphasis in the National College for Leadership in England on developing leaders' emotional intelligence, because you can learn it. The competency, though, is habitual. It's a behavior which we do without realizing, unlike a skill. And so these are really important, and it's tough to change behaviors. And there are four areas. One is self-awareness. Secondly, self-management. And you can't manage yourself unless you're aware of what you're like, which leads to social awareness and relationship management. And so if you're developing leaders, the starting point is for them to be aware of what sort of people they are in order to manage their behaviors in order to influence others. So this is the competency framework which we use in England for the preparation and the ongoing development of school leaders. And so I'd be interested in your views on that sort of approach. Lastly, a colleague and I have been working on a development model for school leaders which is related to the real world of leadership. And again, if any of you are interested, I can give you more information on that. But what we've found and evaluated this in a number of contexts, including in Europe, in China, in Africa, as well as England, is that these things, which you can't read there, but you can download, are things that within a program are very powerful. And they are putting leaders in situations which replicate the ones they will be in the real world. They're active, practical learning, but also linked to theory. Theory feeds in to underpin and deepen the understanding of how you respond to problem solving, for example, which we found often leads to an awakening amongst leaders or potential leaders who start to see their role differently, leading on to the idea of a sense of change of identity for leaders, leading on to a sense of agency, leading on to change in schools. So we know a lot about adult learning, and we can apply this to prepare our leaders to be more effective for this complex, diverse world of education that they're going to move into and are in already. We're in the 21st century. And so these are just some models, as I say, that if you are interested, I can give you more information on. And so, last, before dinner, this is a challenge, a huge challenge, if we're going to get our education systems well led and managed, moving in the direction that we want our children to move. We need to use our intelligences, our rational intelligence, our emotional intelligence. We need to be humble and realize we don't know all the answers. It's much more complex than some people lead us to believe. We need to keep learning. That's the message of people like John Hattie and others. Leaders keep learning. They don't stop learning. They are the lead learners in a school. We need to try our best and enjoy it. And I think this new world is going to be exciting for leaders as long as we keep a sense of perspective and keep learning from our experiences. Thank you very much.
Tak jak wczoraj chciałbym podziękować Robinowi, będę mówił po angielsku. Robin, thank you that you are here with us. I think that we try to be humble and modest, and this will be probably the easiest task that you just established. All others are much more difficult. But in that group, we try to not create recipes, but general directions, and then find what is the best for our students, teachers, school principals. Thank you once more.
Tylko dwa krótkie ogłoszenia. Pierwsze o godzinie 19:00, tak jak to odbyło się wczoraj, zapraszamy na